Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. In this episode, I sat down with Gareth Harris, author of Towards the Ethical Art Museum, a book that's going to be published later this year as part of the Hot Topics in the Art World series by Lund, Humphries and Sotheby's Institute of Art. The book explores why museums have become a focus for society's ethical concerns in the 21st century. I speak to Gareth about his experience as chief contributing editor of the art newspaper and what in his career led him to be an arts writer. I ask him about some topics he covers in his book and how he decided what to discuss and explore within the scope of the publication. We chat about the ethics of funding and patronage, political involvement of cultural institutions, and so much more. Thank you, Gareth, for coming on the podcast, and thank you to Lund Humphries for the collaboration. Before we dive into the episode, I want to take a minute of your time to mention that All About Art is on Patreon. We are mostly volunteer-led, but in order to cover running costs and other expenses, we make it possible for our lovely listeners to support us, ranging from £1 a month to the price of an oat latte a month, or on the higher end, the price of a Sunday brunch per month, depending on the tier you want to choose. If every person who listens to the podcast signed up for the £1 tier on our Patreon, we would be able to sustain the podcast while also having scope to produce episodes more frequently and expand our activities in demystifying the professional arts sector. So, if you want to receive early access to episodes and behind-the-scenes content, maybe you want to get some merch, or if you just love what we do and want to support us, I would be thrilled if you considered signing up. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes. Also, thank you to our sponsors at Synergy Associates, the art world tech gurus, for supporting this episode's production at their clubhouse on Pall Mall. You can find more about Synergy and their facilities in the show notes. And now, on to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Gareth.
Hello.
To start us off, I would love for you to tell listeners about your background. You are the chief contributing editor of the art newspaper. So I am sitting here slightly fangirling just a little bit. Can you tell me more about how you developed your career? What did you study and how did you end up as an arts writer?
This is a strange sort of story. I suppose I got into the art world in a roundabout way. I studied languages, French and Italian, first at Royal Holloway and then at UCL, both University of London colleges. I was a secondary school teacher after I left college, teaching languages. That was quite tough. You need a lot of stamina. After about 4 years, I then switched to publishing, and I was lucky enough to get a job with an art book distributor called Art Books International. And then I managed to get a job as press officer at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I did for about 4 years. So that was 1999 to 2003. It's a long time now. And it was a brilliant entry into the art world because in that press officer job, I managed to chat to journalists, to editors. I was constantly on the phone to them, obviously, trying to plug exhibitions. And I worked on some fantastic exhibitions at the V&A, from Art Deco to Vivienne Westwood. And when I was at the V&A, I then started writing for some publications, art publications, including the art newspaper. I started to do book reviews for them. And the brilliant editor at the time, Christina Ruiz, told me there was a staff writer job available. So I applied and I got that. That was 2003, I believe. So it's been a while. That's 22 years.
You've been at the art newspaper since 2003?
Yeah.
Wow.
2003. But on and off. I mean, I started as a staff writer, then I became deputy editor. I technically became freelance in 2010. So I'm on a monthly retainer at the moment to work on digital and print. So that's enabled me to pursue other projects in between. So I wrote these 2 books,
yes,
which we'll discuss in a sec. The first one was called Censored Art Today, published in 2022 by Lund, Humphries and Sotheby's Institute of Art.
I have that at home.
Oh, good.
And I'm going to be getting your new one once it's bound, but I do have that. I had that already before I even had this partnership with Lund Humphries for these episodes.
Thank you. I'm feeling very humble. But so it's nice. I can do other projects, and I occasionally write for other publications like the Financial Times for the collecting supplements. Somehow managed to finish a PhD in that time.
You did? Oh my God.
I kind of haven't slept. No, I'm fine. I just watch lots of rubbish TV. But yeah, I did a PhD back at Royal Holloway.
Wow. What did you do your PhD in?
It was very PhD-ish, very niche in that it's called Harmony of Fragmentation, a study of simultaneity in the art of Umberto Boccioni and the poetry of Blaise Cendrars. So it's looking at a futurist artist.
The fact that you didn't even read that, you just said that to me, like that you have that in your, like it's ingrained.
It took a long time, but I did it, and it was a long haul, and it was quite a tough journey in the sense it kind of took me at least 10 years, I'm ashamed to say. I don't think you can take that long now. Colleges don't allow it.
Honestly, though, the fact, I think that's actually really amazing because some people think that if you do a PhD, you have to do it in 4 years, maybe not 10 years. I don't know what's allowed. I have never really looked into that. But, you were juggling so much. You were working, you were writing these books and doing a PhD. I mean, bowing down, that is amazing.
I know, but these things, my PhD, it went through lots of corrections. I had to make about 10 major corrections, rewrite some chapters. But, I got there in the end. But it was an amazing experience because then you learn so much more about how to carry out research, even basic things like how to footnote, and those skills are transferable. So I guess I transferred it all to, the books in a sense.
Before we dive into the main topic of the episode, which is your book, I'm curious to know a little bit more about what you do in your job. What does your day-to-day look like at the art newspaper? What are your tasks and your responsibilities?
It's an interesting question. Nobody's ever really asked me this. As I said, I'm technically freelance, but I'm on this kind of monthly retainer. And as part of the retainer, I have to write a certain amount of words each month. And this can be for digital or print. So for online, I write at least one story daily for the art newspaper. I come up with some ideas, or the editors suggest possible stories, and I scan national and international press for ideas or tip-offs, that kind of thing. This is all for our daily newsletter, which goes out every day around 12:30 p.m. UK time. And that's built up a real following now. I think it's really important, the art newspaper newsletter. And it sounds demanding, but finding stories is interesting and fun. There's usually an art story bubbling under. Today I discussed Tristram Hunt's piece in the Financial Times at the weekend, in which he talked about introducing a possible charge on overseas tourists visiting the UK. So in my piece, I opened it up into a wider discussion about arts funding in the UK, the various challenges museums face here because of dwindling public subsidies, I suppose. And then for print, every month in the art newspaper, I write I write the diary page, which is gossip, basically.
Oh my!
I know. Well, it's sort of gossip.
I didn't even know that there was a diary page.
Yeah, it's a really big deal. It was started by a brilliant woman called Louisa Buck, who's a very established journalist.
I know of Louisa Buck.
Yeah.
I don't know her, but I know of
her. So she started the diary, and I continued with that. And it's essential because I think a publication needs light and shade.
Yeah.
I guess that's what you need to say, really. And then there's also a column called Global Briefing, which I write every month, which is a roundup of key international stories, which we feel we need to include in the art newspaper. And then there's lots of other offshoot things the art newspaper does. We produce fair papers at these big art fairs like Art Basel and Frieze.
Yeah.
So we do these daily editions, usually 3 or 4. And we've been doing those for over 20 years now. And they're a challenge. You're producing a daily newspaper on site at the fair.
I know. And it's normally printed in this nice big format.
Yeah.
I always grab one. I just think it's the coolest thing.
Yeah, and we do, it's a brilliant mix of things. We do news, and we do the diary page, and we do curator interviews. We do up-to-date news. Some of it is pre-prepped. 3 or 4 pages of what we call live, with the best news, most topical stories of the day. Yeah, so that's it. I'm a news hound. I'm intrigued by the art world. And I love the platform the art newspaper gives me because I can discuss topics such as censorship.
Yeah.
Which, that's such a pertinent subject now in the light of various geopolitical developments.
Trump.
And I can look at ethical issues, obviously, which links to my new book.
Yeah.
So I'm fortunate, I feel.
Well, perfect segue into my next question, because we're recording this episode to talk about the upcoming publication of your book titled Towards the Ethical Art Museum, the latest in a series called Hot Topics in the Art World by Lund, Humphries and Sotheby's Institute of Art. Your book, which is going to be released on July 8th, 2025, if I'm not mistaken, examines why museums have become a focus for society's ethical concerns in the 21st century. You state in your introduction right away that you're aware that you're basically just grazing the surface of a very, very multi-layered discussion, that you don't cover ethical concerns of sustainability and climate action, for example. Can you tell me what topics you decided to focus on in this book, and also why you ended up choosing the topics to emphasize on that you chose?
That's a really good point. You mentioned that I'm skimming the surface, and I am. These are springboard books. They're meant to be a segue into discussing key issues. As I said, I did Censored Art Today in 2022. But it's interesting. I'm covering this topic, museum ethics, and people say to me, this is so timely. These issues really resonate more than ever. And it's difficult. I've worked on it for the past year. Things change every day. We just discussed geopolitical developments. As you say, the election of Trump is already having a huge impact on the culture sector in America and across the world, really. And also you say that I don't cover other things like sustainability and climate action. Another author is covering the climate issue in the series, so I didn't really want to overlap with her. And the editors at Lund Humphries are very good. They always make sure we're not treading on each other's toes, which is important, actually. So the book is divided into 4 chapters. This was a long process as such. Chapter 1 is called Keeping One's House in Order and looks at issues which could impact museums' reputations, really. And this is a delicate topic, but it looks at who museums are choosing to work with on an international level, for instance. So some institutions, Tate in London, Centre Pompidou in Paris, they are collaborating with countries on certain projects which have concerning records on human rights, such as Saudi Arabia. And this issue, to my mind, will only become more and more pressing as lucrative deals, more funding comes out of those countries as such. So how museums work and who they work with on an international level deserves more scrutiny, I think. It's interesting because museums can partner with who they want to, obviously, and funding is a continual issue. You know, as I've said, state or federal funding as such continues to decrease. So where do museums go? Who do they ask for money? And this also brings in the whole issue of philanthropy, corporate sector, funding, the due diligence museums need to do to ensure philanthropists don't, as such, give them what we call, I guess, dirty money as such. And we can go into this in a bit more detail later, especially in the wake of the Sackler scandal across the US and the UK.
That's like a really, really good example. It's maybe the most famous example.
Yeah, this all came to the fore over the past few years with the Sackler dynasty, and they linked to the global opioid epidemic from which some members of the family profited via the company Purdue Pharma. So I've sort of said that it's interesting that Western museums are going to have to face this issue of who they turn to for money, in a sense. And I have to say, I'm fascinated with countries like Saudi Arabia, which are increasing their presence on the international stage in terms of culture and arts. Saudi Arabia is funding so many arts projects now, and more artists are hoping, I think, to work in the kingdom. But again, you have to consider other things like human rights and issues such as that, perhaps when doing your due diligence and accepting funding opportunities. And who's to say who we should work with? You know, I talked about China there as well. They have a questionable record on human rights. Who's to say we perhaps should work with American companies and museums? You know, there's still the death penalty across certain states, I believe. We have to keep these things in mind. What I'm ultimately asking is, where do you draw the red line? And what I came to learn more and more right in the book is that each museum has to decide for itself who to work with. You know, there are national and international guidelines, there are umbrella ethical codes from museum organizations. In America, there's the American Alliance of Museums, I think, and the Association of Art Museum Directors. They provide quite loose codes around who you should work with and how you should accept money. But ultimately, museums need to work it out for themselves. They're all navigating their way through this maze. And then chapter 2 looks at another huge topic, which I've called ethical collections management. This touches on all sorts of things, restitution mainly. And I've had to be quite methodical in that chapter. That was a tough one. The editors went back and forth with me because they felt my thinking was slightly muddled at first. It's very difficult sometimes, such a vast topic, to condense it in that way. But restitution obviously is a huge issue because I suppose the issue of provenance is one of the most pressing dilemmas faced by many Western museums today. Where do they get objects from? What sort of narrative are they telling? Should the objects ultimately be returned? And this is something that more and more museums are going to have to grapple with. And there is a huge gulf. From my research, I've discovered there's a huge gulf between the ethical and the legal standpoints in this field. There's plenty of guidance with Nazi-era loot, for instance. There were the Washington Principles of 1998, which helped create a moral framework for returning Nazi provenance or Nazi-era art. But museums are still having to, as I said, find their way in other restitution areas, such as colonial-era objects. And on that note of successful legislation, I must say that in the US, there's the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was first enforced in 1990. And actually, I have to say, American museums, North American museums, have really tried to abide by that legislation as such. So, navigating the increasingly challenging aspects of restitution, provenance, decolonization, that became a huge issue post-Black Lives Matter. I think, again, post-Trump, in Trump's second term, this issue is going to take on a new kind of dimension.
Absolutely.
We'll see, because even as I was writing the book, I had to file the final draft as such. In the conclusion, I had to say that worryingly, Trump wants to disband diversity initiatives and plans across US museums. I think the National Gallery of Art Washington was already considering doing that. So I'm slightly nervous because who knows what the new landscape will look like in America on this front. Diversity, equity.
Inclusion.
Chapter 3 is called The Museum and Its Audience. And I look at the age-old topic, I suppose, of whether museums can be neutral spaces today. And recognising that they are underpinned ultimately, I suppose, by ethical concerns linked to society. And I say in the book that for museums to become more equitable spaces, the histories and structures that underpin them must be confronted. And it's quite interesting because I didn't realise there were so many offshoot issues here. And I sort of tried to discuss something called employee activism. And it comes back to what we were just saying. Initiatives furthering diversity, equity from within institutions, which has, those sorts of things have really changed. And in the last 10 years, I suppose, post-Black Lives Matter, post-Me Too, because museum employees have become much more aware of how and why museums should represent themselves to a general public. And there's all sorts of internal issues about whether institutions or certain institutions are doing enough on the diversity front. I mean, museums have a lot to deal with anyway. That's the thing. And I think what I want to really get across is museums are very good at adapting, I feel. I don't know what your experience is, national, local, international. They serve the community well, generally, I think. And they have so many plates to juggle. So where do you start? But we can talk about this a little later. What is a museum for?
Yeah.
And then the last chapter is called Best Practice. I try to discuss certain institutions which I think are doing well in certain areas like restitution and diversity and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
I think that's very good that you are approaching it with a very critical mindset because, of course, you have to. And that is also what this Hot Topics in the Art World series is about. But I think it's the way that you put it now towards the end is thinking about like, yes, museums do have a lot to juggle and what are the best practices and also which museums are doing it in the right way. Like, how can we take example from the institutions that are doing what I guess you believe is the right approach? Because ultimately it is what you believe in your book because you're the author. I think it's quite positive to have, as you said, with what the art newspaper does, having the light and the shade, doing the same thing with your book, in a sense, having the light and the shade.
Yeah, I think so. And also we have, the books are very balanced. We try to be very nuanced in the topics we cover. And as you say, I put forward examples I feel are important and could pave the way in the sector. I talk about restitutions I've just discussed. I talk about the Manchester Museum. I think they're doing great work there here in the UK under the director, Esme Ward. She says, we always frame restitution in terms of losing something. This has to be reframed in terms of gaining something, working towards mutually beneficial relationships with source communities and individuals. And museums are actually doing that on so many levels now.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about money, funding, patronage, government support, all of which you touched on a little bit earlier in this episode, and all of which you touch on in your book. One quote that I read from a museum director that I found quite impactful in your book is, quote, "You have an inherent structural deficit. There's never enough money to do what you need to do. You're always chasing your tail. Unless you have an endowment or reserves, you are constantly and exhaustively chasing your tail to make it to the end of the year." And I read that and I was like, oh. So can we talk a little bit more about that?
I know, isn't that an incredible quote? That's an anonymous US museum director.
Yeah.
I just thought, wow, the pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a really heavy quote to read. I was like, okay, well, I want to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm really glad you singled that out because it just shows exactly what directors have to face every month with paycheck pressure and finding that cash and getting it through to the next month. And as much as I discuss the different issues around why and how museums take money, they kind of have to keep running. I know it's different in America. I think we first need to consider the different funding landscapes in the US and the UK. I'm sure you probably agree that private philanthropy keeps US museums afloat, I suppose, more than here and in Europe. And with so much sort of private capital flowing through the system, there are bound to be ruptures. But then the UK, European museum funding model comes with its own complications. And while many cultural institutions in the UK try to emulate aspects of the US culture sector, including its focus on endowments more and more, actually, the reality...
Can I ask a stupid question?
Oh, yeah.
The difference between like private philanthropy, endowments, that is kind of a dumb question. I don't really know what an endowment is.
Well, I guess from my experience, an endowment is a sort of pot of money set aside that you can turn to, I guess, as such. But the US system is much more based on an endowment, which they can dip into as such. I suppose in the UK, it's much more ad hoc. You rely on an annual grant from the government.
Yeah.
I mean, endowment just means savings to me as such. I'm not always sure what the operational costs are drawn from for a US museum.
Okay.
So perhaps they dip into the endowment for certain parts.
Yeah. A lot of different places use endowments.
But it's not something we're used to in Europe or the UK. We're used to that kind of funding from the government as such. That's what we've always relied on.
Yeah.
And what's happened over time, especially post-Thatcher, and Blair, is that museums in the UK have been encouraged to generate their own income as such through the gift shop, that kind of thing, through blockbuster exhibitions, which hopefully will make a profit. I'm not sure that always happens. So the UK model has had to adapt a lot in the sense that government funding has dropped. You make up the difference with private money. And that can be philanthropy or it can be corporate sponsorship as such.
Yeah.
But as I kind of keep saying, there's issues with who gives the money. But museums do have ethics committees now. I mean, I want to keep emphasising this throughout, that national museums, especially in the UK, have these very rigid ethics committees which do their due diligence, which check who the donors are and their credentials. So it's important. But as I say in the book, institutions are now increasingly paranoid about accepting dirty money tainted by dubious donors, and I put that in quotes. We've already said this. This all came to the fore over the past few years with the Sackler crisis. But there's even more scrutiny now regarding private donors and corporations. And as you say, US museums, in the quote, are bottomless pits. I think I said moneyless pits. I don't think that makes sense. And every US museum is completely individual with their own ecosystems. And in America, there's the added complication of trustees as donors. That's another ballpark altogether. But I mean, if you cast your mind back over the past few years, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the headlines in the UK about certain sponsors. So recently, the BP, the oil giant, announced 50 million funding for the British Museum's master plan, which caused a stir last year. The British Museum has to refurbish its galleries. It's going to cost a fortune, almost 1 billion, we think, at the art newspaper. That's a lot. You're not going to get that money from government. So
yeah, ticket sales, government.
I know.
That's not necessarily a realistic.
Yeah, and I think Nick Cullinan, who's quite new at the BM, he was appointed director last March.
Yeah, he was prior to that. He was the director at the
National Portrait Gallery. He came onto the Art Newspaper's podcast at Christmas, and we asked him about the BP donation and how he feels and the implications. And I think he said something along these lines. Ultimately, when you have to raise hundreds of millions of pounds, you need to have a very good reason for turning down £50 million. He's practical. It's pragmatic. I think he's right in a sense, but the reality of the situation is that museums will need to think more and more about private funding. And coming back to what we said before, the next big test for UK museums is whether they accept funding and support from regimes such as Saudi Arabia. I think that's the next test. For the book, I spoke to Benjamin Soskis. He's a really clever guy. He's a senior research associate at the Centre on Non-Profits and Philanthropy in Washington.
Mouthful.
I know. And he said to me, I think moving forward, there's going to be an expectation that the donor relationship is less transactional and has a larger moral identity, getting at the identity of the institution itself in more ways. So I think he's probably saying that people will need to align their ethical concerns with the ethical concerns of the donor as such. It has to be a more holistic approach, which sounds a little bit puffy and cheesy, but I think have to be more due diligence with regard to donors. But back to the issue of the problematic regimes, I've spoken to Ivona Blaswick. She was the former director of the Whitechapel Gallery in London. She's now running a lot of major public art projects in Saudi Arabia. She's working on a major public art initiative in Wadi Al Fan Valley, it's called. And Patrick Moore, he was the former director of the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. He organised a big Andy Warhol exhibition in Saudi about 2 years ago. But they're very much of the opinion that it's better to have this dialogue with Saudi than not have the dialogue at all. And it is polarising art world professionals, which side you fall down on. Should you just ensure the dialogue happens, or should you close it down? You either jump in, I guess, head first. I don't know. I mean, perhaps we should be encouraging the dialogue because ultimately artists will be supported, more exhibitions, might happen. But I think it's very much drawn a dividing line amongst art world professionals.
I think I can say that I'm more on the side of encouraging that dialogue than I am of shutting things down. I do think that we live in a society, especially through social media, that is incredibly polarized, very black and white. I don't agree with that in every sense. I mean, again, I can return just briefly back to Trump. I mean, I know people who voted for Trump. I obviously have family in the United States. I have friends. I have people I grew up with in the United States. One or two of those people voted for Trump, And so I'm not sitting here saying, well, okay, I'm never going to talk to you again. I also listen. I do judge. That trend, we listen and we don't judge. No, I listen and I judge. But I'm not going to sit here and be incredibly black and white about it. I'm going to think about it with nuance. I'm going to think about what sort of things led to this person potentially making that decision. What sort of things do they believe? Because making it black and white and between good and bad is not going to actually get us anywhere. Within your book, you also discuss whether it's possible for museums to be neutral spaces. You use an example of when far-right riots were happening in the UK in August of last year, and the director of the National Museums Liverpool, Laura Pye, intervened with a statement basically condemning the violence. This opens up the conversation of whether museums can or even should remain impartial regarding socially engaged and geopolitical subjects. And, if they should, quote, operate from a neutral position of privileged authority, as you put it. And I found that really, that line I was like, okay, yeah, that makes so much sense. Also with the aspect of privileged authority as well. So can we delve into that a little bit further? How do you explore this in your book?
I think this is fascinating. I think the fact that Laura Pye said, this isn't protest or freedom of speech, it's racism and should have no place in our society. I think that is the most admirable, courageous statement a museum director could give, to be honest. I was amazed he didn't get more coverage, in a sense. But that kind of intervention, I think, is sort of rare from a museum director as such. But I was amazed she stepped in and said it, and all credit to her. I think most museum professionals today are adamant that museums cannot operate in a bubble, and they are aware that most decisions they take come with consequent ethical implications as such. But as you've just said, that privileged authority aspect, the perception of museums has changed. So I suppose when I was a child, a long time ago, there was a kind of prevailing school of thought linked to the genesis of the Western Museum, which maintains that museums should remain centres of academia and scholarship as such, operating from a neutral position of privileged authority. But that perspective has changed as audiences become more activist, and movements such as Black Lives Matter surged, with museums shifting to community-led agendas. It's not to say they weren't doing that before, because they were actually, especially in the UK. But it took on a new sense of urgency, I think. And in that sense, they've had to take a stance within their own backyards, I think espousing a sort of type of local activism. I don't know if you'd agree. But whether it's impossible today for museums to remain completely neutral is up for debate. There's always contributory external factors, from trustee politics to exhibition programming.
Which is where it gets even more complicated when trustees are also funding.
Or politicians. Because they can be in the UK. But how does a museum remain neutral?
I think that's a utopic idea. I don't, as much as we would love, yes, funding for museums to be, in the excess, and as much as we would love people to take culture as seriously as we take it here in the sector, and as much as we would love the idea of the museum as a neutral space of cultural exploration or whatever, that is literally just not possible. It's not. I don't think so. But
it's not. I mean, a caption, a community event, online content, they're all taking some sort of stance. They're not impartial actions as such. So, I mean, I suppose that's the case with every organisation, but more so with a museum.
Even deciding what exhibitions to show. None of that is neutral. None of it.
No, and I mean, it's fascinating how this has developed in the past few years. Tate especially has been criticised for being more woke in its approach. There's been one or two exhibitions, especially at Tate Britain in the past few years, where...
with the rehang. I remember that, yeah.
There was a big exhibition on Hogarth. There's currently a show at Tate Britain called Photograph in the 80s. And some national newspaper critics have pointed out that the captions are, yes, too woke as such, too hectoring. You know, they're set in a certain agenda, perhaps more left-wing. And some critics have pointed this out. So, you know, Tate perhaps is taking a stance in that kind of sense. But it's difficult, isn't it? Because you have to appeal to different audiences. Perhaps a more traditional audience, more right-wing, would not appreciate the kind of approach Tate has taken in some shows. Not all shows, I have to say. So it's fascinating how some museums are more vocal than others on certain issues. But, you know, I do include, I think, quite a few juicy quotes in that chapter. I mean, David Fleming, the former director of National Museums Liverpool, he's linked neutrality and ethics, which I think is an intriguing mix. He said, pretending to be neutral is unethical, pretending that the museum has no bias and contains nothing other than scholarly exhibitions is unethical. So I find that fascinating. Pretending to be neutral is unethical. So do you step up? Do you say what you feel? Well, I mean, at the risk of alienating certain audiences?
But even, you know, pretending to be neutral as unethical, I think the first thing that came into my mind was this whole idea, just very generally within society, when you ask somebody like, oh, what do you think about politics or something like that? Like and someone says, oh, I don't really know anything about politics. And it's like, that is such a privileged position to be speaking from when you are not affected so much so that you don't need to think about it, which is basically like cis-het white men, right? Like that's the demographic here, because everyone else is affected by politics quite strongly. And so we all kind of look into it a lot more because it's like, how will this change things for me? However, I think that also when you act from a space of neutrality, or when you say that your actions and, you know, scholarly efforts and output through that is somehow neutral, that also is almost taking a stance of saying this is the baseline, or this is the norm, this is the standard status quo, right? In a way, because that's neutral. It's not good, it's not bad. But so you're actually trying to define the status quo, which is quite a big thing, no? Or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think saying that you're neutral means that you're smack dab in the middle, which is neither good nor bad. So for me, this is the norm. I don't know.
Well, it's just, to my mind, it's impossible to remain above the fray with a mix of contemporary politics, concerns around issues such as climate change. I suppose museums are going to have to become, or will become, more and more political in that sense. But I do take the point that how can you accommodate different demographics under one umbrella? It's very, very hard. And I think we have to keep saying whether museums have the bandwidth, I love that word, to become so enmeshed in community affairs activism is debatable. You know, on a practical level, resources and funding have to be allocated in certain ways. So where do you put the money, and how do you fuel certain parts of the museum, or certain aspects, or certain attitudes?
Relating to your conclusion and what you just said, what can and should museums do today to operate ethically, you know, in your view?
Gosh,
I know that's a big
question. I've sort of said in the book, there's no golden template for ethical governance at museums. But what can be concluded from my analysis, slightly controversial, is that ethics not a major priority at most museums. This is a blanket view. You know, there are ethics committees, but my impression from my research is that I don't know if ethics is always an overriding concern, because let's be clear, as I've said, life, reality, events take over, funding. As I said, I'm always heartened. Museums are very good at acclimatizing. So I'm just trying to think, this was really made me think, actually. I was thinking, what can museums do, well, I suppose the scope of ethics committees needs to extend to look at precisely what is acceptable in relation to major donors. I think that's still, there's more work needs to be done. Museums do need to carry out more due diligence. From where I'm standing, there's not enough scrutiny. Younger audiences, we have to keep thinking about who's going to come to museums in the future. They're going to have the stewardship of museums in the future. Young people favour a move towards transparency. I know it's predictable, perhaps that's a predictable thing to say, but this word pops up all the time, transparency. Institutions perhaps should not be hiding behind freedom of information requests, perhaps. Not everything can be made public, of course, but I think people, visitors, audiences, they do notice key sponsors, key patrons of exhibitions, that kind of thing. And they do, something chimes in their mind about what companies do and what they stand for. What I found as well is some of the US guidance from American Alliance Museums was a bit loose, a bit patchy on ethics. There's not much. I mean, they may disagree with me, but I couldn't find masses of guidance from those US umbrella bodies. So they need to kind of beef those up across the board. I'll be fascinated to see what ICOM do and what the UK Museums Association do. So that does need a little bit more. They need to be more substantial, those ethics guidelines.
I think your point on transparency, even though you say like, okay, yeah, that's a buzzword for today's day and age. Like, I'm right in between being a millennial and a Gen Z. I'm born in 1996. And for me, seeing what, for example, the White Pube does when they publish everything, they publish their books. They publish everything that they intake, everything that they spend, like their income, all of that. And I think that is amazing. I love that. And I also think salary transparency comes into that, also in museums in the cultural sector. But I want to ask you my final question of the episode, and it's a fun one that I like to ask all of my guests just to have a nice, fun end. If you could pick one artist from art history to have dinner with, who would it be and why?
I have to turn back to my PhD here, a bit pretentious, and say the futurist Umberto Boccioni. Hugely underrated, but at the dinner party, I'd be really keen to discuss his innovations in painting and sculpture. His sculpture, unique forms of continuity in space, is a futurist masterpiece, kind of ripples outward into the environment, penetrating the air, as we say. In his manifesto on sculpture, published in April 1912, Boccioni stressed how his works fuse with his surroundings, saying we will break open the figure and enclose it in its environment. Kind of revolutionary at the time. He was only 33 when he died in 1916. He fell off a horse.
Oh.
But along with the other futurists, he changed how we see and depict energy. And it was such a raw, frenzied moment in time as technology was advancing. The cubists were shaking everything up. So I'd ask about all sorts of things linked to the period. And if Umberto Boccioni can't be summoned from the afterlife, I'd love to break bread with Marcel Broodthes, the Belgian conceptual artist, who made poems embedded in plaster, weird mussel shell pieces, palm tree works. Yeah.
I love how you snuck a second guess.
I did, because I just can't answer this at all, really.
I know, it's a horrible question. It's horrific. Some people try to be like, oh, who would you have dinner with? And I'm like, nope. I have answered it once or twice, but
yeah,
it's really dependent, isn't it? It's such a huge question because there's so many people that we'd love to see and meet and talk to.
Yeah, well, I really had to think carefully about that one. But yeah, Boccioni's so
you
underrated.
Did write your PhD on.
I know. Perhaps it would be a detailed chat, that one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, Gareth, thank you so much for coming on All About Art, for telling me more about your upcoming book, and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.